The Nazca Lines sit on a high, arid plateau called the Pampa Colorada, roughly 400 kilometers south of Lima. It is one of the driest places on Earth. Almost no rain falls here, the wind is light, and the ground is nearly undisturbed. Those conditions are exactly why lines scratched into the Earth 2,000 years ago are still visible today. The plateau is covered with a thin crust of dark, iron oxide-coated stones. Whoever made the lines simply removed that dark crust, exposing the pale yellowish ground beneath. The contrast between dark surface and light subsurface is how the images survive. The designs fall into two broad categories. First, there are the figurative geoglyphs, recognizable shapes including a spider, a condor, a monkey, a hummingbird, a whale, and a humanoid figure sometimes called the astronaut. Second, there are geometric forms, straight lines that run for kilometers without deviation, trapezoids, spirals, and zigzags. In total, the lines cover an area of roughly 500 square kilometers. The figurative images tend to be smaller, averaging between 50 and 300 meters across. The straight lines and geometric shapes are often far larger. The longest straight lines run for many kilometers, up to around 48 kilometers, though the documented trapezoids are generally under about 1 kilometer, with the largest measuring around 950 meters. The people who made them are known as the Nazca culture, a pre-Columbian civilization that flourished in this region roughly between 100 BCE and 800 CE. They were not isolated. Trade goods, textiles, and artistic styles show connections to neighboring cultures across the Andes. The Nazca were sophisticated weavers and ceramicists, and their art is rich with animal imagery that echoes what appears on the plateau. Archaeologists have found no written language, so the lines cannot be read as text. What survives is the physical record, the lines themselves, burial sites, ceramic vessels, and the remnants of their settlements. The outside world became properly aware of the lines in the late 1920s, when commercial aircraft began flying routes over southern Peru. Pilots reported strange markings on the desert below, and word reached archaeologists. The Peruvian archaeologist Toribio Mejia Zespe made the first formal study in 1927, after encountering them on foot. Then, in 1941, the American historian Paul Kosok flew over the plateau on the day of the winter solstice and noticed that one of the long lines pointed almost directly toward the setting sun. He called the Nazca Plateau, perhaps too hastily, the largest astronomy book in the world. That offhand description would shape decades of theory and debate. Kosok's observation drew a young German mathematician named Maria Reiche to the plateau. She would spend the rest of her life there, more than 4 decades, measuring, cataloging, and defending the lines. Reiche became the foremost champion of the astronomical hypothesis. She argued that the lines functioned as a vast solar and lunar calendar, with each geoglyph or geometric feature aligned to a significant astronomical event. Her work brought international attention and eventually Peruvian government protection to the site. She is remembered as the Lady of the Lines, and without her the plateau might have been heavily damaged before proper study began. The astronomical hypothesis was compelling, but it faced a serious challenge in the 1970s. Astronomer Gerald Hawkins, the same researcher who had analyzed Stonehenge's alignments, applied computer analysis to Reiche's data. His finding was blunt. The lines showed no statistically significant alignment with solar, lunar, or stellar events beyond what chance would predict. A later study by Anthony Aveni reached a similar conclusion. That does not prove the Nazca had no interest in astronomy. Their ceramics show astronomical symbols, but it strongly suggests the lines were not primarily an astronomical instrument. The calendar theory, as the sole explanation, did not survive scrutiny. As the astronomical theory faded, researchers looked more carefully at the landscape itself. The Nazca Plateau is an extraordinarily dry place, but it is not waterless. Beneath the surface run ancient underground aqueducts called puquios, some of which are still in use today. Archaeologist David Johnson and others noted that many of the straight lines and trapezoids point toward or terminate near sources of underground water. The theory that emerged was that the lines functioned as ritual pathways connected to water and fertility, that walking them was a form of prayer or ceremony to bring rain. In a desert society, water is everything, and the lines may have been the most elaborate form of supplication ever built. Anthropologist Johann Reinhard extended this thinking into a broader sacred landscape framework. He argued that the Nazca geoglyphs were not meant to be seen from above at all. They were meant to be walked. The lines and figures functioned as ceremonial paths connecting different sacred sites, mountain peaks, water sources, and ritual centers. Reinhard pointed out that similar path-based ritual traditions exist across the Andes to this day. The idea that the lines required an aerial view to make sense, he argued, says more about modern assumptions than ancient intent. The Nazca may have experienced these figures from within them, as a pilgrim walks a labyrinth, not a viewer reads a map. A different approach came from experimental archaeology. In 1982, researchers Joe Nickel and others demonstrated that the basic tools available to the Nazca, wooden stakes, rope, and simple surveying methods, were entirely sufficient to produce the lines with the precision we see today. No advanced technology was needed, and no aerial view was required to lay them out. A team of ordinary people working with stakes and cords could replicate a large geoglyph accurately in a matter of days. This was a significant finding. It removed one of the most persistent mystifications from the debate. The lines were extraordinary in scale and intent, but not in the technology they required. That leads directly to one of the stranger chapters in this story, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. In 1968, Erich von Däniken published Chariots of the Gods, arguing that the lines were built as landing strips for ancient spacecraft. Chariots of the Gods itself sold roughly 7 million copies, and von Däniken's collected works have sold tens of millions, somewhere between 50 and 70 million, lodging the idea permanently in popular culture. The idea does not survive basic scrutiny. Landing strips need to be flat and firm, and the desert surface is neither reinforced nor structurally different along the lines. More fundamentally, it assumes that the Nazca people were incapable of such an achievement on their own, an assumption the experimental archaeology flatly disproves. It is worth naming because it has dominated public perception of the site for decades, but archaeologists do not treat it as a serious hypothesis. More recent fieldwork has recentered attention on the Nazca people themselves and on what was actually happening at the site. Archaeologist Marcus Reindel and his team spent years excavating settlements and burial sites near the plateau. They found evidence of large communal gatherings, feasting, ritual deposition of ceramic vessels, and offerings, concentrated at the edges and ends of the geoglyph lines. This strongly suggests the lines were places of activity, not passive monuments. People came to them, performed ceremonies at them, and left offerings. The lines were lived in, not simply looked at. One specific discovery deepened the water connection considerably. Researchers have found that the majority of the animal geoglyphs, the ones most visible from the air, were located near water sources or at confluences of drainage lines. The spider geoglyph, for example, is widely interpreted as a rain and fertility symbol. The hummingbird is a pollinator associated with flowering plants that appear after rainfall. These associations may not be coincidental. The animals depicted may have been chosen precisely because of their cultural connection to water and seasonal change. Then there is the question of who exactly was making these lines. For most of the 20th century, the Nazca Lines were treated as the product of a single unified culture with one coherent purpose. More recent analysis has complicated that picture. The lines were not created all at once. They were made over a span of several centuries, and different figures appear to belong to different periods. Some lines actually overwrite earlier ones, suggesting that the plateau was used continuously and that its meaning or function may have shifted over time. What was begun as one kind of ritual act may have been continued, amended, or repurposed by later generations. The Nazca civilization itself did not fade quietly. Evidence points to a catastrophic climate event around 500 CE, a prolonged El Niño that brought devastating floods to some areas and intensified drought to others. The Nazca's carefully managed agricultural systems, including those puquios, were overwhelmed. Settlements were abandoned, populations shifted, and the culture that had built the lines for centuries entered its terminal phase. By around 800 CE, the Nazca as a distinct cultural entity had dissolved. The lines remained, but the people who knew what they meant were gone. Today, the Nazca Lines are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Designated in 1994, they face real and growing threats. In 2018, a truck driver drove onto the plateau and damaged 3 lines. The tracks are still visible. Climate change is altering the wind and rain patterns that have preserved the lines for 2 millennia. Illegal mining, squatter settlements at the plateau's edge, and agricultural encroachment all represent ongoing pressure. The preservation of the lines is now as urgent a question as the explanation of them. New technology is still changing what we know. Since 2019, a team from Yamagata University in Japan has used artificial intelligence to analyze ground survey data and aerial photographs. They have identified over 300 previously unrecorded geoglyphs, smaller figures that had gone unnoticed for decades. Many of the newly identified figures are humanoid, and many appear to predate the larger animal geoglyphs. The picture of who made what and when is still being revised. So where does the evidence actually leave us? The water and ritual hypothesis has the strongest support in the current literature. The confluence of landscape analysis, ceramic evidence, feasting deposits, and cultural analogy from across the Andes all point in that direction. But no single theory has yet been accepted as complete. The lines almost certainly served multiple purposes across the centuries they were built: ritual, social, territorial, and symbolic, and no one framework may ever capture all of them. The honest answer is that we understand the Nazca Lines far better than we did 50 years ago, and still not nearly well enough. What strikes most people who study the Nazca Lines closely is not the mystery itself. It is the scale of human effort behind it. Generations of people in one of the harshest environments on Earth chose to spend enormous communal energy scratching images into the ground. They did not build temples or pyramids or monuments that would rise above the horizon. They marked the Earth itself, quietly and precisely, in a language we are only beginning to read. Whatever the Nazca intended, they built something that has outlasted their civilization by more than 1,000 years. And it is still asking questions. If you found this mystery as compelling as we did, subscribe for more stories from history's unanswered questions.